But hi, welcome. My name is Martha Campbell, and I am MFA's Communications Manager, and I would like to welcome you to tonight's We'll Talk with Artists. Our digital discussion tonight is with the abstract painter Jen Sterling. Jen is a more recent MFA member, as she's also recently become a full-time artist. Jen's passion for color and energy is obvious from her palette, creating work filled with emotion. I would also like to introduce the head of our show, Will Scott. Will is an art historian with an extensive career as a photographer and the former head of adult programs for the National Gallery of Art. He is uniquely qualified to help bridge the gap between artists and the public, and he will be our guide into the art world tonight.
Thanks to Jen for being willing to participate and be interviewed in the series. Her work is abstract and very dynamic and very vibrant with its color and its brush stroke. So Jen, you had an extensive career before you devoted yourself recently to full-time painting. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you were doing in those roughly 30 years between college and now?
Yeah, that little bit of a gap. Sure, I started out as a designer, so a graphic designer doing art on the commercial side. So I didn't want to be the starving artist that everybody talks about. So I took my creative outlet into the design side of the world, and for about 30 years ran my own companies, doing design, typesetting, branding, marketing, and recently sold the firm to my employees. And am now off and running and doing art only, and I love it.
When you were working as a designer, was it always in the Washington market, or was your clientele more broadly scattered than that?
It was mostly here in the tri-state area. We've got clients that range, up and down the East Coast, and in fact, beyond that, especially if we had a client who moved or an employee who moved to another company and took us with them. So our work expanded quite a bit, but focused primarily here.
And were you always the creative driver? Were you the one that sort of created the style and maintained it or developed it?
I was in the beginning, and I think that's when I really loved what I was doing. And towards the end, I had a whole entire staff that was doing all of that, and I was looking at spreadsheets. Yeah. And I think that's what drove me out eventually. So
yeah. Well, so what was it that enabled you to make the transition? Had you taken painting courses, studio courses as an undergraduate or anywhere along the way? Or did you just have this talent that you knew you could paint and wanted to explore it?
I am self-taught. So I've always loved art, but I have never been able to fit in the studio courses when I was doing my design courses. So other than basic design skills and training, obviously, but the actual painting classes and drawing classes and such were not on my list.
Okay, well, now Martha actually, in our pre-session conversation, made me think of this by something that she said offhandedly. And I also discovered when I was reviewing Jen's CV on her website that she was studying at GW as an undergraduate when I was an adjunct professor teaching the history of American art. So here comes the toughie, Jen.
Okay.
This is your quiz for today's session, today's class. Are there any American painters that you're familiar with their work and that it's influenced your work as an abstractionist?
Ooh, that's a very good question. My work is influenced by quite a few different artists, and I think that is both fine artists as well as designers, because there are designers and illustrators that have had obviously a huge impact on my perception of art and color and design. God, to pick just one though, I mean.
Well, no, any, if there are some, you're obviously thinking there are some, tell us who they are.
Oh, the Expressionists, absolutely. Any and all of the Expressionists were very much on my list. So I love Picasso's work. I love Rothko's work. I love, oh my God, I'm totally having a complete brain freeze. I love them all. There are There are artists that do a completely different kind of work than I do, that are very representational, that are very rigid or structured, or even that are in a completely different medium. They might be photography, for example, that have an impact on my work. It's a way of seeing the world and a way of portraying the world. And I will take little bits and pieces from each of them and just soak them in and then turn around and spit them out on canvas, and you'll never really know where it came from, but
Yeah.
I can probably bury them back.
Yeah. So do you get that familiarity with other artists that have a positive influence on you, or that make you think of different creative approaches through going to museums or taking courses or reading, or, you know, how's that happen for you as an artist?
Museums, when we could do that, absolutely. I love crawling through museums anywhere and everywhere I travel. But books primarily. I grew up in a book household, so I have books everywhere all the time. And when I get into a new topic, I will completely go crazy. I recently, in the last year or so, got very into color, for example, and I now have probably 20 books on the history of different colors. And I love reading them and finding out all the details and the facts behind them. So I do the same with artists.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting, and of course, to an art historian, the idea of reading books and being influenced and your creativity stimulated by that is very close to my heart, if you will. But I'm thinking of one American woman painter in particular, Joan Mitchell.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's your gesturalism. Her color, of course, is usually more muted and more related to nature's own colors. But there's something about the way in which you work that made me think of Joan Mitchell when I first saw it.
Thank you.
So why don't we go ahead and dig in then and start looking at the slides that we select. You know, I didn't think of this, and I should have, Jen, as a trained art historian. When you said the expressionists, I started to think of some of the German expressionists. Are you familiar with people like Ludwig Kirchner and his group of German painters?
Yes.
And is this in any way related, or, well, talk about it a little bit. Beginning is a title that really is evocative when you see this very strong in brushwork and color image. So what is beginning?
So for me, this was the beginning of me being an artist with a capital A. So this was the first piece that lived outside of my studio and was seen by people other than my family. I had been painting for many years at this point, but it was always for me, and it was always internal, and I was always, I don't know, it was more therapy at that point, I think, than, you know, art. And at this point, this was a piece that spoke so powerfully to me about the start of something. It very much evoked a phoenix coming out of the ashes. You know, this is the start of a new me. And so this is the piece this is why I titled this piece Beginning. It's very much an emotional piece for me. And in fact, I use this on all of my corporate branding for my art business because of that. It was the start. It was the kernel that got everything rolling for me.
Yeah, well, it is very powerful, and the palette is very much like many of the German expressionists, or the group they called themselves Die Brücke. It also reminds me a little bit of Munch, and that maybe is just because the Scream has been in the art news recently, but it certainly, I see the similar palette. Where did you exhibit this and other early pieces, and where does the MFA and your participation with us fit into that exhibition opportunities for you?
So I actually moved to Maryland only 5 or so years ago. So my membership with MFA is fairly recent. Back when I was in Northern Virginia, this piece, for example, hung in my office, in my studio, the design studio. So I would occasionally show a piece in a corporate office. I would occasionally show a piece at a local gallery or show if it were accepted. But I wasn't actively pursuing getting my work out there in a large fashion, doing festivals or one-man shows or anything like that. So pieces were slowly creeping out, and they were donated to a lot of art auctions, and then commission work. So they were shown in people's houses.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So why then did you join the MFA if you already obviously had established some ways in which to share your work with a public?
Because I think it's important to network within your art community. And I think when I moved here, I came obviously with a business background. I came with my company and my network that I'd been building for 30 some years, but it was based in branding. And I needed to immerse myself in an art market and meet other artists of all different kinds and really find out how people think and get inspired by their work and see where they're showing their work. And I found the MFA to be a very professional and centralized place to do that. So all of the events and the shows and the people and the staff, it made it a very welcoming way to enter the art market here in Maryland.
Well, great. I'm glad you joined us. I really do like your work very, very much. And so let's look at the next piece. Now, your palette across the pieces that I saw on your website, and even the few that we're going to show to our audience tonight, is quite varied. How do you go about deciding what colors you'll use in any particular composition?
Each time I sit down to paint, it is a matter of what I'm feeling that day. Unless something has been specified in advance, in the case of a commission, I may be trying to match somebody's, house palette or office palette. In this case, this was a commission, but all I was given was a size and one particular gray from this person's house. And they said, just paint what you think of when you think of my family. And this family is very outdoors, very energetic. They do a lot of things together. And the rest of the color palette built as I went. And it was really kind of interesting. About 2 years after this piece had been hung on their wall, I received a call and she said, "Did you mean to put a word in it?" And I was like, no, what are you talking about? She goes, "It says family." And when you look at it in the dark blacks, it says family. So it was this wonderful thing that came about because I was painting them. And I've enjoyed watching that happen with several commissions where I know the people in particular, and I've been able to bring things out for them. A lot of that has happened. So it's fun to be able to express in color or shape as I go, as I'm thinking of them, as I am feeling them or their intentions, it comes out on the canvas.
Before I ask my next question, please, if you think that this is any way going to invade their privacy, just let me know and we'll move on. But the commission for this piece, was it somebody that you knew personally, that was a personal friend that you knew well for some time?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so I knew her family and was able to reflect it.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating to hear. That's literally the grist for an art historian to write about an artist. And I don't think I ever would have been able to wrap my head around that, except the birch, and then saying that you did it for someone who loves the outdoors. I think it would all fall into place. But just hearing you talk about it and the connection you have with the commission, the family that commissioned it, that's great. That's a special kind of talent to be able to cross all of those bridges and tie everything together like that.
Thank you.
Next piece, please. I love blue. I think blue might be my favorite color. So I'm really into this one. And the title seems to be a little more straightforward than the previous two pieces. Was that intentional? And was it some, a day at the beach or the lake or something that made you think about creating this painting?
No, actually the color palette and the pops of green reminded me of Dory in Finding Nemo. So that's where the title came from. But it's interesting to me that the couple that contacted me, they live in Texas, and they called me. I've never met them. I don't know them. And the gentleman said, the title is what grabbed me. He's like, I saw the piece, and as soon as I saw the title, I knew I had to have it. He's like, I need to look at this every morning and know that I just need to keep swimming. He's apparently 90 or so, and is an art lover, and they were doing a new place, and he's like, I have to have it. I'm like, okay, then we're going to ship it to you.
Yeah, just as soon as we can.
Exactly.
Yeah,
but no, that's where the name came from. Names almost always come after the piece is completed.
Oh, sure.
And generally it will be something about the piece that triggers the name, but this just happens to have been a very simple one.
my other question about this piece is the brushwork is so much more varied, and there are even passages, the drips or the swirls, that do remind me very much of the American abstract expressionists of the 50s and 60s. What was it that motivated you and led you to such a varied use of your materials in this composition?
So a lot of that in this particular case happened because this piece was painted in several sittings. The piece had been done originally at the beginning of lockdown, and it was very dark and it was very heavy, and it was very reflective of my mood in the beginning. And I kept looking at it in the studio, and I kept getting frustrated. I didn't want to have it be done at that point. And there's actually a video, I think on Facebook, on my account, where I'm live painting on this piece and trying to bring the lightness back into it and the color back into it. So a lot of that variation of stroke in this case is because it was done over such an extended period of time. It was also quite intentional. You know, I wanted very much to show the variation and the depth and layer and feel that was happening at the time, that was going on in my head. Yeah, I mean, the dark is still in there, but I'm trying to overlay it with that light and life and looking for the silver lining to the fact that I'm locked in my studio. You know, I can't go see people, but I can sit here and paint. That's a good thing. I shouldn't be dark.
Yeah. Well, it is very marine to me in the sense of if you've ever been scuba diving or snorkeling, and you see the changing colors depending on the depth of the water and the green of aquatic vegetation and the yellows and other bright colors of some of the aquatic animals. So you've really got, for me, this kind of visceral experience of a watery environment. And that's a lot different from what you just showed us too. So it's nice to see your range here. Next, Martha. This is one I could do the art history thing, but I think that's one of those times where I have to dial that back, because then I'm sort of telling you what, and this is the thing that most artists dislike about art historians, I'm telling you what you were thinking.
It's fascinating to hear it from somebody else, trust me. This is actually another commission piece. This was done for a couple for their anniversary. So all of the bits and pieces in it are stories from their life and their relationship. And the wife actually told me this story about when they were first dating, and they had gone to this watering hole with a bunch of friends, and you had to jump off this really tall rock, and she was terrified. And he said, "Jump, I'll catch you." And when she jumped in, he literally caught her and brought her up to the surface of the water. And it was just such a powerful story to them. It's what played into the piece. But there's all kinds of little bits and pieces in here from their travels and music that means something to them, tartans from their families. It was a lot of fun to work on. And I enjoyed very much hearing the stories from both of them and being able to put it into the piece.
The crescent moon and the star, are they from South Carolina, or are they Muslim or Turkey?
Turkey. They were traveling on their honeymoon throughout Eastern Europe.
Yeah. Well, what does the color mean, since it is so much based on the stories of their shared experiences? There's lots of red and black and white. So
yes, and some green, which is hard to see in the photo. This is one where the color palette was really driven by them. They provided me photographs of the room where they wanted to hang this, and the carpet and the pillows and the couches and everything that was involved. And I asked for a couple additional detail photos. And so this is meant to tie that room together. The other thing that I think was really fun about this is that they gave me one big space of where they wanted to hang this. And when I went back to them, I proposed it to be in 2 panels because they have twin boys. And I didn't want them fighting over the painting. So someday each boy will get 1 panel.
Now, that is a very pragmatic approach to the art of painting. Everything that you said, especially creating 2 panels, because you know that there are 2 children that might one day possess the individual panels.
Mm-hmm.
The mythology of the contemporary artist, the modern artist, is, oh God, that's so commercial and mercenary. What's your response to that kind of thinking?
It's all about the art buyer, about the collector. You know, I can express myself in my art anytime I want to, and I can do it in pieces that are sold or not sold. But when I'm doing a commission for somebody, to me, I think my design and branding background comes out. I need to solve their problem, their issue, and deliver to them something that serves their needs. Yes, it's painted in my style, but it is done in a way that it supports them. So I'm fine with that. I actually enjoy that about projects like this. I think that, you know, the fact that I can turn around and paint beginning and do it however I want. And if someone wants to buy it, great. And if somebody doesn't, great. I still painted what I wanted.
Yeah.
But in this case, it's about them. It's not about me. I am just the vehicle to get that message across for them.
Right. Well, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to that big question. In fact, as an art historian, I would say that throughout most of Western history, that is the way that even the greatest artists have had to work or wanted to work. Michelangelo might be the greatest. If any of you in the audience know about his conflicts with Pope Julius, then you know that there was always this back and forth. I'm paying, I'm paying your fees, you do what I say. And he's saying, no, I'm the great creator, great artist, and so I'll do what I want to do. And, you know, so, but it's interesting to hear a contemporary working artist speak to it so clearly. Next slide, please. I have to say, and now I'm going to be the art historian, and we want to talk about this in the next slide, our last slide together, and for you to do most of the talking. But as soon as I saw this image, without looking at the title, I thought of people like de Kooning among the abstract expressionists, and even Jasper Johns.
Oh, I love Jasper Johns. Yeah.
So I'm not crazy. I really can see something that affected you in this.
No, absolutely. I am such a huge fan of his work. There's actually a piece downtown I go back and visit regularly. It's one of my pieces. You know?
Well, do you want to look at the next image before you talk about them, or do you want to just jump right to the next image?
Yeah, we can jump to the next slide. That's fine.
Okay.
So those of you who have a Mac will recognize the image on the right. These are calendar shots off of my iCal. This is what impacted this work. This was done during the pandemic, and I was doing all of this thinking about what my life was like before the pandemic and what's it like during the pandemic and what's it going to be like after the pandemic. And I wanted very much to make sure that I remembered the feeling of sitting still, the feeling of having this great pause in our life. And, you know, before the pandemic, I was go, 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 go. As you can see in the calendar shots, those are actual weeks. There was stuff going on all the time. And so this piece is very reflective of what life was like pre-pandemic. Very busy, very overlapped, lots of things happening at the same time, lots of layers to life. And I want to make sure that now that we're coming out of all of this, knock on wood, that I take the time to, you know, separate the colors a little bit and have a little bit more space and breathing in life and be able to be present. So this piece was driven very much by the calendars, and I thought it would be useful for people to see that directly.
Well, that's fascinating to hear, both so that I better understand your work in this very vibrant image, but also, you know, that idea of layering meanings and basing your work on such a personal kind of experience of the world of life, that's central to Jasper Johns' work. Many people don't know how complex and layered some of his most famous works are. So it's just interesting to hear you sort of talk about it in the same way that we know, mostly because he doesn't talk at great length usually about his work, from what art historians have discovered about his working process. So I think that's our last image, isn't it, Martha? Oh, here we go.
One more.
One more. Save the best for last.
Oh, thanks.
This looks like a photograph that well, a couple of photographs I've taken driving up Main Street towards the church during the rain.
Yes.
So, anything like that inspiring you in this piece?
Yes, it is very much lights reflected in the rain on the street. I just love all the lights and signs and street lights and buildings and everything coming down and reflecting on the road and creating such a beautiful texture.
Yeah. Yeah, and the one thing I like about that same thing is when you're photographing through, as I do sometimes, through the windshield, you have the water droplets on the windshield, and if it's raining, you have that, and you have all of these refractions and reflections going on simultaneously. And so I think you've really captured that kind of vibrancy in this image, and it's so different from the one we were just looking at and talking about.
Yes, I've got a lot of pieces now that are heading in this direction where I've been experimenting with colors and layers and textures, less of the you know, sort of wild gesture and a little bit more of a depth. I've been really enjoying getting in and experimenting with this and the textures underneath it and the multiple layers, and I'm not sure where it's going yet. I've got 4 or 5 pieces currently running in the studio in various stages that are very similar in this style. So it'll be fun to see what happens with them as I keep working.
Well, just a final question about this piece and where you may be going. To me, this seems entirely possible that the palette of color was selected by something you actually saw on a street in the rain, thus making it very close to nature, even though very abstract. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's very fair.
And is that where you think you'll be taking this, that you'll be inspired by nature and the palette that you select, and maybe even some of the compositional forms will still originate in a specific experience of nature, the world around us?
The first couple did. I think that the ones that I've done since, the more recent ones, are less driven from nature and more driven from the energy that I see between the colors. I am fascinated with color. Color can completely change my day from good to bad. So I spend a lot of time playing with it and being able to pull colors I wouldn't even normally be drawn to, and seeing how they play against each other and how they play under each other and how they play, you know, across the canvas from each other, and what impact that has on the piece and how it feels. So I think it's less driven by nature as I progress in this series, and more driven by the emotion of the color itself.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm only going to say this because of the way you've branded yourself as an artist, and your reference to your red hair. And there are a lot of redheads in my family, and redheads are supposedly very intense, expressive people. Yeah. And your work certainly seems to bear that out.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I had a coach who kept telling me, you need more neutrals in your art. I'm like, no,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's your art.
I am not neutral.
Yeah. Well, great. That's good to hear, and it's certainly evident in your work. So I think we've taken our time and used it pretty well, and we've left 20 minutes or so for questions. So have at it.
So we do have one question in the chat, which I'll read off from Malka. How do you ship your acrylic pieces without losing some of the surface?
Okay. So I use a sort of like a refrigerator wax paper as a first layer around the painting. And then I've got foam corners and bubble wrap around that, and then cardboard around that. So nothing is actually on the surface of the painting other than that wax paper. If you put the bubble right on there, you'll have bubble dots on your painting, which gets very frustrating because you don't want that unless you painted them there. So that's what's worked for me so far.
I'll throw in a quick answer from my experience as a courier for the National Gallery. Of course, they would make a special crate or renovate an existing crate for every painting that was going to be shipped. And for all paintings, they would create this deep foam sort of spacer. And then there would be something rigid. It could be a piece of plywood or other material, so that the surface of the painting would probably have at least 2 inches between it and what was covering it. And then there'd be a heavy wooden, there were heavy wooden crates usually with a very heavy wooden top on it. So you're doing that in a more expeditious way. And the gallery obviously had lots of money they could spend on that.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, what is refrigerator paper that you say?
It's like parchment paper or wax paper that you would cook with. You can actually buy large rolls of it so that you can get them much wider.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Sure.
Okay, other questions? Raise your hand or unmute and speak up.
I have a question. Do you ever experience a blank canvas? And when you do, how do you get past it?
Yes, they're terrifying. And so I tend to close my eyes and throw paint at it. As long as there is a mark on the canvas, I have something to react to. The blank canvas it's much like a writer looking at a blank page. It is the worst, worst, worst thing you can do. Thank you for asking.
I think Chris was raising his hand, Chris Fowler.
There we go. Yeah, it's Klein who said, of course, finishing paintings is easy. It's starting them, it's hard.
Yeah, I have. Go ahead.
Okay, I was struck by your remarks early on about how representational painters had affected your abstract art. And I was wondering if you could choose one and indicate how he or she affected, how that's worked into your abstract art.
Sure. The first one that comes to mind would be John Singer Sargent. There's a piece in particular of some young girls in the garden with these globe lanterns, and they just, the light from them is so amazing. I mean, you sit in front of this painting and it literally glows. And I love the color play in that. So that would be one that has definitely worked its way into my art.
Lily Rose.
Report about Sargent. Right.
Valia, do you want to unmute yourself?
I would like to ask, when the painting you start, it's not a commission. Do you have already the full idea of what are you going to paint, or just the colors? How do you start with the idea is coming, it's already ready in your head, or starting to paint, it's coming and it's getting more and more and more, and finally it's something different that you start with?
It has happened both ways. There are times where I have an image in my head and I'm like, oh, I need to get this out, and I get that image out. And the calendar one, for example, is an example of that. The rest of the time, and I would say the majority of the time, it's something that happens to me while I'm painting. I will go into the studio and I will go to colors that I'm gravitating towards that day. And as I start to paint, the way I'm feeling that day, what I'm thinking about that day is what's starting to be reflected on the canvas. So if it's something that I finished painting that day, it's probably very representational of my mind that specific day. If it's something that happens over several weeks, then I may start to react to what's on the canvas, maybe take it in a direction, like I may start something and go, oh, I know what I want that to do, and then take it that way. But it's funny, a lot of my favorite pieces are ones that I had no idea when I started what I wanted it to look like, and it came out of me during the process.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you.
We have a question in the chat from Janice, who asks, who do you get to do the framing on your larger pieces?
So I have a couple different framers that I work with. Most of them are local. There's the Whimsy Cove over on Chinkapin Round. Then there's also in the local by design, there's Portside Framers. They used to be in Maryland Hall. I will occasionally have frames built by a local workman who has done work around my house, and he'll build me custom frames for some of the really, really large canvases that I have. I tend to paint big a lot of times, and it's hard to get a commercial frame at that size without really, really like getting a bank loan. So I will have him build them for me sometimes.
Can I ask, jumping off of that also, do you make your own canvases?
I have not made my own canvases myself, with one exception. My husband built me these really cool frames based on this idea of wrapping a canvas around a wall. And so I've had to stretch those myself. And what I need to do is find a gallery that has some corners so that I can actually hang them, because I'm really excited about how they look. But otherwise, I will buy pre-made canvases or custom made canvases to certain sizes.
Okay.
If anyone else wants to ask a question, you can raise your hand. You can type it in the chat.
I have another question. As an artist, would you say that you have something on your bucket list of someday I want to create blank?
Ooh, that's a very good question. Yeah, I would say on my bucket list, someday I would like to have a piece of mine owned by a contemporary art museum. Part of their collection. Just a small wish.
Go big or go home.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, nobody else is waving their hand or adding to the chat. Jen, I don't know why you were nervous. Jen told me just before we began that she was nervous because I think you were articulate and you were energetic, and it was really fascinating to hear you talk about your art. And I'm glad that you participated this evening. And I look forward to talking to you more and seeing more of your work.
Thank you so much.
And Martha, thanks again for your excellent help. And
of course, and before we go, I do have to plug once more. Collector's Choice is coming up. You could go home with Jen's piece, with Will's piece. You could go home with a whole
Chris's
list
piece
of other
or
pieces.
Deb's piece.
Or anyone's piece. Yeah, we have over 100 pieces this year. So swing by the gallery to come check it out in person. I'll be wearing a mask when you come in. So just look for, little brunette sitting in the corner. And I can help you get tickets or raffle tickets or whatever you need. I would also like to say that our next Will Talk is not until April 6th. We'll be talking with Frances by Wilson. She's a relatively new member as well. And she is a really interesting sculptural artist who creates these figures and forms out of pliable tree bark that she uses some sort of like material to solidify and create very interesting statues. So come back for that.
Yep. Well, thanks to everyone who attended tonight. And I hope you found it as lively a conversation as I did. So good night, everybody.